Among the most notable books in the library of the University of Seville are the 5 volumes with the Postillae litteralis, Old and New Testament Apostilles by Nicolás de Lyra. A codex commissioned by the Sevillian nobleman Per Afán de Ribera in the second third of the 15th century. Per Afán de Ribera was the grandson of the first adelantado of Andalusia, who in 1411 had instituted a patronage in the monastery of Santa Maria de las Cuevas, where he would be buried in 1487. The arms of the promoter stand out in the frontispiece of the 5th volume, within a tanda divided in 4 and inscribed in a rectangle with birds, hybrid beings, and a lion in the corners. The coats of arms Sotomayor de Ribera and Ayala, of the paternal branch, occupy the upper quarters, and the maternal, Moreno and Guzman, the lower ones. These arms and those of Sotomayor de Ribera, that still remain in the inferior margin of the first folio of the 2nd volume, accredit the origin of their lineage of the Ribera de la Torre, differentiated from another family branch of the Ribera, the branch of Catalina de Ribera and Frederic Enriquez de Ribera, that descends from Per Afán de Ribera, the first, and his second wife, Aldonza de Ayala, and that was the branch that maintained the position of adelantado of Andalusia. In his will, at 1487, he decreed that his firstborn son, clergyman Diego López, chaplain to the Catholic monarchs, should receive all his books of law, theology, and arts to pass on to his grandsons Diego López and Per Afán, sons of his second son, who inherited the entailed estate. Later, his library's books arrived at the Carthusian monastery of Santa Maria de las Cuevas, the legal administrator of the entailed estate. They remained there until the disentailment process of the 19th century and the Royal Order of the Ministry of the Interior of 1838, which decided to move the books of suppressed convents to university libraries in provincial capitals that had them. The 5 volumes of these Postillae are a very careful work made in Seville in the second third of the 15th century that gather in their textual and figurative invoice characters of great interest for the history of the manuscript book in this city. The colophons of these codices provide relevant information on their manufacture. In this colophon for the first volume, it states that Per Afán de Ribera commissioned it as Archdeacon of Cornedo in the Church of Compostela, and it was finished in the year 1434. Per Afán, however, would abandon his ecclesiastical career a year later. He would find marriage with Constanza de Guzman, with whom he had 2 children. By the end of his life he had amassed an important patrimony and reached a high cultural level, the result of his education and his readings. The 5 volumes present numerous reading annotations of a person of great culture, contemporary to the confection of the work, a good Latinist, knowledgeable of the Christian authors and of the Latin and Greek classics. The Postillae Litteralis is the most widespread work of the Franciscan Nicolás de Lyra and is considered the culmination of an exegetically movement, that is to say, of interpretation of the Holy Scriptures, which had begun in the 13th century and which defended the use of the rabbinical tradition in the literal explanation of the Bible. Nicolás de Lyra was a highly influential Franciscan theologian and biblical commentator in the 14th and 15th centuries. Little is known about his life. He was likely born in Normandy, served as provincial of his order, and was a theology professor at Burgundy College, University of Paris, where he died in 1349. In the Apostilles, made between 1322 and 1331, Nicolás de Lyra provides a clear textual exegesis of the Bible, linked to a significant figurative one, differentiating Latin and Hebrew interpretations. This visual interpretation was copied and illuminated in late Middle Ages codices and printed from 1485 until the modern age. The commentaries on the Old Testament are the first 3 volumes of Per Afán's commission, produced between 1434 and June 1437. Petrus Gallicus copied the first volume and participated in the next 2 volumes with Jacobus Parisiensis, leaving a record of his work at the end of some chapters and in the colophon of volumes 1 and 2. Both write the text in 2 columns, with the textual Gothic script that manifests forms typical of their origin and certain prehumanist traits developed at the University of Paris. The copyist Peter of France has extensive experience, makes very few mistakes, and always concludes the folios with a horizontal claim in the lower margin, next to the notebook's fold, along with 1 or more words that also serve as a reading guide for the companion folio. He writes the notices for the chapter headings in Roman characters and typically leaves a record of his work at the end of certain books. Peter of France subscribed the colophon of the first volume, shared the second and third volumes with Jacob of Paris, and both authored folio 210 recto of the second volume. This second copyist is less careful, commits a greater number of errors in the copy, does not usually make claims, uses Arabic numerals in the notices for the chapter headings, and sometimes his lines tend to get crooked. The prologue of the second book of the Maccabees had to incorporate it at the end of the commentaries to this book, before continuing with the indexes of the Old Testament and subscribing alone the colophon of the third volume, although the first 7 notebooks were written by Peter of France. This work was completed in the year of our Lord 1437 on the eve of St. Thomas Aquinas, Jacobus Parisiensis, in Seville, commissioned by Per Afán de Ribera. The commentaries on the Gospels occupy the 4th volume, copied in humanistic fermata script, round, in 2 columns and by several hands, in the middle of the 15th century after the previous ones. This changing character between tradition and modernity, between Gothic and prehumanist elements, which can be observed in its material workmanship, is also evident in the layout of the folios, in the wide margins, in the notices, in the claims, in the labeling of the titles of the chapters, and even in the colophon, where the order of the Domino Petro Fanio de Rivera Accurate Transcripta is written. In its illumination and in that of the 5th volume there are analogies and characteristics typical of the Sevillian workshops active at the same dates, with some copies conserved in the Cathedral of Seville and in other book deposits. The colophon of Volume V repeats the mention of the promoter, omitting the topographical and chronological references. This last volume of the Postillae contains the epistles, Acts of the Apostles, and the Apocalypse, written in 2 columns in Gothic cursive script. The strokes recall those of the scribe of another codex commissioned by Per Afán de Ribera, finished in 1465, which is also preserved in the library of the University of Seville. It is the Rhetoric of Aristotle, translated from the Greek by Jorge Trapezuntio, or from Trebisonda, a renowned humanist contemporary of Per Afán de Ribera. The illuminators of the first 3 volumes have the style of the 1,400 miniature manifested in the initial with figures from the Book of Ezekiel. The remaining ones maintain the traditional Gothic vines in color on gold leaf, and others present flowers, vegetations, and fish of naturalistic character and nuanced color. The same origins are clearly evident in the rest of the figures within these volumes, crafted with covering paint, and whose marginal annotations adhere to the usual guidelines of the specialized copyists who meticulously labeled the titles to indicate the illustrations to be created by the illuminators. These annotations, along with the empty spaces for certain figures, indicate changes in criteria after the copy, which pertain to the assembly pieces of the tabernacle boards and one of its curtains. The iconography of the Apostilles continues the variants investigated in other codices from the middle of the 14th century, in which the alteration of some of the original proposals of Nicolás de Lyra is observed, such as the figurative omission in the plan of the tabernacle of any reference to its ligneous and portable structure, and the substitution in the Temple of Solomon of the figurum fundamenti for a conceptual image that synthesizes the plan and longitudinal section of the building. The figures and reconstructions of the buildings that serve as visual demonstrations of the text are based on Catholic and rabbinical sources and were copied, drawn, miniaturized and engraved in printed manuscripts from the 14th to the 17th century. The interpretative proposals of the Temple of Jerusalem develop orthogonal schemes and continue the approaches initiated by Richard of St. Victor and Maimonides in the 12th century that made forget the identification and disposition of the Hierosolymitan Temple as a building with a centralized plan. The 40 figures of the Old Testament sanctuaries, their objects of worship, and the reconstruction of the Temple of Solomon and the visions of Ezekiel represent buildings that sometimes evoke the contemporary French architecture of the Cape at Valois, while in the plan of the new city the traditional representation from the Romanesque period is maintained. The Franciscans' relationship with the French court, especially with Blanche of France, widow of Ferdinand de la Cerda, and with Queen Joan, the wife of Philip VI, gave him direct knowledge of these buildings, in particular with the audience hall of the Parisian Palais de la Cite, whose construction and wooden roof reminded him of the house of the Forest of Lebanon that Solomon built in Jerusalem. The facade of the entrance to the outer atrium of the Temple of Ezekiel is directly reminiscent of the towers of the Royal Palace in Paris, still preserved on the left bank of the Seine, and many elements of the planimetry of the Temple of Ezekiel are related to the building organization of the defensive enclosure of the Castle of Vincennes and its keep, where the library and personal study of Charles V of Valois was housed.